You are in a small French town in August of 1951, and by morning, people cannot stop screaming, not from pain, from what they are seeing. A postman collapses in the street, convinced he is being chased by tigers. A boy tries to jump from a second-story window because he believes he can fly. A woman is found in a field, certain that her heart has been physically removed from her chest, still speaking calmly about it, as if reporting the weather. One man is later restrained by 3 people because he is convinced his body is already on fire and keeps trying to throw himself into the river to put it out. Doctors arrive to find dozens of townspeople in this state, some laughing, some in agony, some simply gone, staring at nothing. This is not a plague village from the Middle Ages. This is Pont-Saint-Esprit, a modern French town with paved roads, telephones, and a train station. The year is 1951, and whatever is happening to these people, it started the same way it always seems to start. They ate bread. Within days, over 250 people would fall ill. 50 would be committed to psychiatric hospitals, some strapped into straitjackets and chained to beds simply to keep them from hurting themselves. Several would die. Investigators would eventually trace the outbreak to a single bakery, Roch Briand, and to the flour it had used that week. But here is the part that should unsettle you. Nearly 70 years later, historians are still not entirely certain they know the full truth of what happened in Pont-Saint-Esprit. And that uncertainty exists because this was not a new mystery. It was the return of a very old one. A mystery that had haunted Europe for over 1,000 years. One that had a habit of destroying communities without warning. And one that people spent centuries blaming on saints, sinners, and the devil before they figured out the truth. The truth was smaller than a grain of wheat, and it had been growing quietly on their most essential food this entire time. To understand what happened in that town in 1951, you have to go back nearly 900 years earlier, to a nobleman named Gaston of Valois. In 1095, Gaston's son was suffering from a condition that had no name doctors could agree on. His limbs had begun to swell and blacken. He described a burning sensation so severe that some who suffered from it were later recorded begging to have the affected limb removed, just to make the burning stop. There was no surgeon who could explain it, and no physician who could cure it. Gaston did what a desperate father in the 11th century did. He turned to relics, bones, and remains of Saint Anthony, a 3rd century hermit famous for resisting demonic temptation in the Egyptian desert. His son recovered. Whether that recovery came from prayer, from the relics, or simply from being taken away from the food that was poisoning him, nobody at the time could say. But Gaston was so certain of the miracle that he and his family founded a religious order dedicated to treating others with the same affliction, the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony. By the end of the 15th century, that order had built roughly 370 hospitals across Europe, hundreds of them, which tells you something important before we go any further. Whatever this disease was, it wasn't rare. It was common enough and terrifying enough to justify building an entire continent-spanning medical network just to treat it. The hospitals themselves were unsettling by design. The walls were painted red, deliberately, to echo the burning sensation the patients described. The monks wore black robes marked with a blue cross, moving through wards full of people whose hands and feet were slowly turning black and dying. There was no anesthesia for what came next in the worst cases. Gangrenous tissue simply detaching from a living body, sometimes at the joint, sometimes on its own. They called it Holy Fire, or St. Anthony's Fire, and for a long time, it looked less like a disease and more like a curse with a schedule. It would appear suddenly, in specific villages, usually after a wet spring. Entire families would be struck at once. Some victims developed the burning, blackening limbs that had afflicted Gaston's son, gangrene creeping up fingers and toes until, in severe cases, the tissue would die completely and simply detach from the body. Others developed a very different set of symptoms: violent convulsions, muscle spasms, crawling sensations under the skin, and hallucinations vivid enough to make grown adults believe they were being pursued by animals, or transformed, or possessed. 2 completely different diseases, it seemed. Except they weren't appearing in different villages by coincidence. They were, somehow, related, and nobody in medieval Europe had any framework for understanding why the same curse could burn one town's limbs and unravel another town's mind. One outbreak in 1994, in France, is estimated to have killed somewhere between 20 and 40,000 people. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground. Not a battlefield, farming villages, in a normal year where families sat down to the same bread they'd eaten their entire lives, and within days, some of them were dying of gangrene, while others nearby were seized by convulsions nobody could stop. No army, no visible enemy. Just an ordinary harvest that had turned, invisibly, into something else. The monks of St. Anthony didn't understand the biology. What they understood, whether they realized it or not, was the fix. Their hospitals fed afflicted patients a diet built around grain-free bread, or bread made from wheat instead of rye. Many patients improved. The monks assumed this was the healing power of the saints' relics working through prayer and care. In reality, they had accidentally discovered the cure by removing the poison, without ever identifying what the poison was. That's the strange, quiet detail sitting underneath nearly 600 years of religious explanation. The treatment worked, nobody understood why. It would take until the late 17th century for anyone to connect the dots. In 1670, a French physician named Thuillier examined outbreaks of the illness and made the observation that would eventually crack the case. The disease consistently followed the consumption of rye bread, and specifically, rye that had been harvested during unusually cold, wet growing seasons. He tried to convince farmers of this. Most of them didn't believe him. It would be another 200 years before the connection was widely accepted. Wet weather, rye, a disease that behaved almost like it had a season, a diet, and a preference. That's not the profile of a curse. That's the profile of an organism. The organism responsible is a fungus called Claviceps purpurea. It infects rye and other grasses, replacing individual grain kernels with a small, dark, curved structure called a sclerotium, visually almost indistinguishable from a normal grain of rye sitting in the field, until you know to look for the slightly wrong shape and the deep, purplish-black color. Damp, cool conditions during flowering are exactly what this fungus needs to spread through a crop, which explains the pattern the monks had unknowingly treated for centuries: wet spring, infected rye, outbreak, and rye itself made the problem worse in a quiet, structural way. It was the cheapest staple grain available, which meant poorer communities, who could least afford alternatives, were disproportionately exposed to a disease that many at the time simply assumed was divine punishment for poverty. But identifying the fungus didn't explain the two different diseases. That answer came later, and it came from chemistry. Ergot, the common name for this fungal growth, produces a family of compounds called ergot alkaloids. These aren't a single poison. They're a chemical toolkit, and different alkaloids in that toolkit do different things to the human body. Some of them are powerful vasoconstrictors. They clamp down blood vessels, restricting blood flow. In the extremities, where circulation is already at its most vulnerable, that constriction can be severe enough to cut off blood supply entirely. Tissue starved of oxygen begins to die. That's the gangrenous form of the disease, the blackened, burning limbs that gave St. Anthony's fire its name. Other alkaloids in that same fungal toolkit act directly on the nervous system. Structurally, they're close enough to serotonin, one of the brain's own signaling chemicals, that they can interfere with the same neural pathways serotonin uses. That interference is what produces the muscle spasms, the convulsions, and the hallucinations. That's the convulsive form. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Researchers studying historical outbreaks found something close to a geographic divide. West of the Rhine River, France and similar regions, outbreaks were almost always the gangrenous kind. East of the Rhine, in Central and Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, they were almost always convulsive. Only a handful of recorded outbreaks in history show both forms occurring together in the same population. The best explanation isn't that the fungus itself was fundamentally different in different countries. It's diet. Different regions ate rye prepared differently, alongside different foods with different nutritional baselines, and some of those factors appear to have influenced which of the fungus's chemical effects dominated in the body. Same poison. Different regional collision with human biology. Two diseases that were, underneath it all, one organism expressing itself two different ways depending on who was eating it and how. That single insight quietly answers something that had confused physicians for 6 centuries. But it also opened a door that historians wouldn't walk through for another few hundred years, on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1976, a behavioral psychologist named Linda Caporael was looking into one of colonial America's strangest episodes, the Salem witch trials of 1692. It began with two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, exhibiting violent convulsions that a village doctor couldn't explain. He landed on the only diagnosis available to him at the time: bewitchment. Within months, roughly 200 people had been accused, and 20 had been executed. Caporal noticed something. The symptoms described in the court records, the convulsions, the crawling sensations on the skin, the visions of specters, the reports of being pinched or bitten by invisible attackers, matched, point for point, the profile of convulsive ergotism. She checked the weather records. The winter before the outbreak had been severe, the following spring unusually damp. Exactly the conditions ergot needs. Rye was the staple grain in Salem village at the time, and most of the accusers lived in the swampy, low-lying western section of town, precisely the kind of ground where the fungus would have thrived. It's a compelling case. It is not a proven one. Other historians pushed back almost immediately, pointing out that in most affected households, only one or two family members got sick, even though the whole family would have eaten the same bread. A genuine ergotism outbreak tends to hit entire households at once, not selectively. Some researchers have argued the Salem crisis fits far more naturally into a story about religious tension, social rivalry, and fear feeding on itself, with no fungus required at all. Which means Salem sits exactly where good historical mysteries tend to sit. Not solved, not dismissed, just close enough to plausible that it refuses to fully let go of you. If you're the kind of person who enjoys discovering the hidden logic behind historical horror stories like this one, this channel exists for exactly that. Now, back to the mystery. Which brings us to 1951, and to Pont Saint-Esprit. By the time of that outbreak, ergotism was supposed to be a medieval relic. France hadn't seen a confirmed case since 1816. Agricultural methods had improved. Grain inspection existed. And yet, for several days in August, a modern French town displayed nearly every symptom the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony would have recognized instantly 900 years earlier. Burning limbs, convulsions and hallucinations, vivid enough that patients had to be restrained. Investigators at the time settled on contaminated rye flour from the Roquebriound bakery as the most likely cause, and for decades, that explanation held. But it's worth being honest about something the neat version of this story usually leaves out. The case was never fully closed. A French judge involved in the official inquiry raised doubts about the ergot explanation. Later researchers proposed alternative causes: mercury-based fungicides used on the grain, or chemical bleaching agents in the flour. In 2008, a Cornell historian spent years examining the evidence and published a 1,000-page study that concluded none of the existing explanations, ergotism included, fully accounted for everything that happened in that town. There's also a stranger footnote. An American journalist later alleged that the CIA had a hand in the incident, tied to Cold War-era experiments involving a very specific chemical compound. French investigators and most historians have treated that theory skeptically, and it remains unproven. But it's worth mentioning for one specific reason. That compound was LSD, and LSD's own origin story runs directly, unmistakably through the same fungus that may have poisoned Pont Saint-Esprit. In 1938, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was working at Sandoz laboratories in Basel, trying to synthesize new medicinal compounds from ergot alkaloids, the same class of chemicals responsible for the gangrene and convulsions of centuries of St. Anthony's fire outbreaks. Ergot alkaloids weren't purely destructive. Midwives had used ergot extracts for generations to induce labor and control bleeding after childbirth, long before anyone understood the chemistry. Hofmann was trying to refine that medicinal potential into something safer and more precise, hoping for an improved stimulant for the heart and lungs. The 25th compound he synthesized in that research program was lysergic acid diethylamide. Early tests on animals showed some restlessness, but nothing dramatic. Sandoz lost interest. The compound sat on a shelf for 5 years. Then, in April 1943, Hofmann returned to it, and somehow absorbed a trace amount through his skin during the process. He went home early that day feeling strange, lay down, and experienced what is now recognized as the first LSD trip in human history. Vivid colors, altered perception of time, a dreamlike state he couldn't fully explain. 3 days later, deliberately this time, he measured out what he assumed was a cautiously small dose, and took it intentionally, to confirm what he'd felt wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a fluke. It was, at the time, the most potent psychoactive substance ever identified by a chemist, in a dose smaller than a grain of salt. Sit with that for a second. The fungus that medieval Europe fought with saints' relics, and the drug that would go on to define an entire chapter of the 20th century. The counterculture movement, psychiatric research, decades of cultural argument about consciousness itself, trace back to the exact same organism. One thread runs from a nobleman's son with gangrenous fingers in 1095, through hundreds of monk-run hospitals, through unexplained epidemics that killed tens of thousands, possibly through a Puritan village convinced it was surrounded by witches, and lands, 8.5 centuries after Gaston of Valois, in a chemistry lab in Basel, Switzerland. Today, ergotism is genuinely rare. Grain inspection, fungicide use, and modern storage methods have made contaminated rye flour reaching your table extraordinarily unlikely. But the fungus hasn't gone anywhere. Claviceps purpurea still grows on rye fields every wet spring, exactly the way it did 900 years ago. It's simply being caught before it reaches your bread. The chemistry that once convinced entire towns they were cursed is now manufactured deliberately, in controlled doses, for medicine that treats migraines and complications in childbirth, descendants of the exact compounds Hoffman was chasing. The next time you're holding a piece of bread, that's worth remembering. For most of human history, the thing standing between your dinner and a hallucination or a slowly blackening hand wasn't medicine. It was luck and the weather, and whether that particular field had a wet enough spring for a fungus you couldn't see to take hold in the grain you couldn't tell apart from the rest. If you want to see where the next strange thread in this history leads, you know where the subscribe button is.